In this video, we're going to discuss plant reproduction. This is the third video in the plant unit that focuses on the organ called the flower. So it's important to understand that two types of reproduction exist in plants. You can have sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. When you have asexual reproduction in plants, we call that vegetative reproduction, where some plants can actually reproduce asexually from fragments of certain parts, like their roots or their shoots, by using mitosis. So you can take a look at some specific examples on page 592 of your textbook. So for example, if you take a dandelion, the taproot of a dandelion, you can actually use that piece to grow another dandelion, and it grows just through mitosis, so it'll be a clone. Some plants can grow through their modified structures. So if you look over here at the potato, it has a modified stem structure over here. You can just throw that into the ground with the potato, and then more potato plants can grow from that as well. So that's just some examples of asexual reproduction in plants. Make sure you know that they can do that, and take a look at some specific examples on page 592. And again, here you can see our potato going through asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction does have several benefits. So if you are dealing with a good plant with some good traits, that trait will continuously be preserved because you're going to make clones of the plants that you already have. It takes a lot less energy. You don't need any specialized structures to do asexual reproduction, and only one plant is needed for that. And studies have shown that the asexual plantlets, the baby plants that are produced by asexual reproduction, are actually more robust. They seem to have better earlier survival rates than the ones that are produced by sexual reproduction. But there is one big trade-off with asexual reproduction, and that's lack of genetic variation. You create these monocultures that, yeah, they might all have the same good trait, but they also have the same weaknesses. And if one pest comes along that destroys one, then there goes your whole culture. So we call it a monoculture, genetically identical cultures. So I do want you to read up on page 593 to 594 about how humans use asexual reproduction in plants, and you should know what the term grafting means, how it works, and what the process is involved. So as we mentioned, there's a lot of strength to asexual reproduction, but there's also some weaknesses, primarily that there's lack of genetic variation. As a result, there is an advantage to being able to reproduce sexually, and that is to produce variation. So we're going to talk about sexual reproduction in plants in a bit of detail. Specifically, we're talking about sexual reproduction in seed plants. So we're going to look at the seed first, and the seed has several functions. The first is to protect and nourish the embryo, the plant baby that's growing. And the second is that the seed can actually be used to carry the embryo to a new location. You can actually dispersal of the plant to a new location where there might be less competition from other plants that are trying to grow as well. And so there's different ways to disperse the seed. You can do wind dispersion, where the wind will spread the seed to different areas for the plant to grow. You could have animal dispersal, where an animal might eat, for example, a fruit containing seeds, and it might poop it out somewhere, and then the seeds can grow in the new area. Or you might have some seeds that latch on to animal fur, for example, and then that's dropped off in some new area as well. Sometimes you might see explosion dispersal, which is basically when, if you look at the example here of peas, the pods will dry out, and then the peas will start to flick out into different locations. And then you have the drop and roll. So if you take a look over here at the horse chestnut fruit, this thing will drop, split open, and then the seeds will roll out and then grow in a new location. So seeds have these two main functions: to disperse the seeds, and also to protect and nourish the embryo. So you do need to know the anatomy of a seed. You should know the difference between the monocot and the dicot seed, as we mentioned earlier in the diversity unit. So you should know that the seed has the embryo, which is the baby. So we have the baby over here. It has tissue that provides nutrients to the embryo. It also has a seed coat, and the seed coat offers extra protection. So remember also that when we're dealing with an angiosperm, the seeds are found in fruit, and when you're dealing with gymnosperm, they're not found in fruit. So for example, we saw gymnosperm, the seeds were found on pine cones. And again, you take a look at the monocot, we have one cotyledon, and you take a look at the dicot, you have two cotyledons. So sexual reproduction is costly. It does require structures that are solely dedicated to that process, and so that does require a lot of energy and resources, but there are several benefits. As we mentioned, it gives you more genetic diversity, it gives you ways to disperse the seeds, and also it gives these seeds a backup plan. In case conditions are harsh, the seeds can stay dormant and stop and wait to grow until conditions become better again. So it enhances survival in that sense as well. So we'll take a look at sexual reproduction in gymnosperm. We've seen it already, but we're going to focus on the wind pollination. So here we have a mature sporophyte, this big organism over here, this big tree, and it will contain some. We have over here. This one has some female pine cones and some male pine cones over here. We'll start off by taking a look at the female pine cone journey, and then going afterwards take a look at the male pine cone journey. So if we go to the pine cone scale for the female over here, it's currently diploid. There's an ovule within it, and so that ovule, by meiosis, is going to produce this thing called a megaspore. So we went ovule 2N to haploid megaspore. And this megaspore will develop into the gametophyte, which will contain two eggs over here. So it contains two egg cells. So we have the first half of this sexual reproduction done. Let's go take a look at the male. So these are the smaller male pine cones over here. The male pine cones, they are going to produce the pollen, which is the male gametophyte, which is going to be haploid. And then what's going to happen is that the gametophyte will contain pollen grain, which is basically the sperm. So it's inside the gametophyte, inside the pollen. The pollen grain will go and fertilize the eggs over here. And so after that fertilization, we're going to see a diploid zygote that forms, and it's usually only one of the fertilized eggs that forms a zygote, and will actually develop into a seed. So this zygote will start to grow, and over here you can see the different parts. The embryo is the baby, the seed coat over here, the endosperm to provide some nutrition to the growing baby. This seed will develop into a seedling, which becomes a sporophyte, and that sporophyte will grow into this big thing here again, which will have cones on it to do this whole process over again. And so that was sexual reproduction. We saw gametes fuse. We saw there was a female component and a male component. And again, we saw the seedling becoming a sporophyte, and that sporophyte has the gametophytes on it to make the gametes. And this is the way that these gametes were able to fuse with each other was through wind pollination. So the wind blew pollen from the male pine cones to the female pine cones, and then fertilization was able to occur. This is just another image illustrating what I just explained. Make sure you can explain plant reproduction in gymnosperm using these diagrams. And you should focus on the key terms. If you look at your textbook, there are some key terms that are defined more specifically. Make sure you go back and review those and add those to your notes. So now we'll talk about sexual reproduction in angiosperm, which are basically the plants with flowers. So they're seed plants that have flowers. And the flower in this case is actually considered an organ. So the flower is an organ, and it's specifically the sex organ. So after reproduction in an angiosperm seed plant, the seed will be contained in a mature ovary, and that mature ovary is what you commonly refer to as fruit. And so we'll take a look at how that works in just a few slides. So again, just a reminder as to what an organ is. In the previous lessons, we saw the root, we saw the leaf, we saw the stem and focused on those. We briefly saw the flower, but now we're going to focus on it in more detail. You do need to know how to label flower parts. So it's very important that you know the flower structure. As mentioned, the flower is an organ, so it's made up of many tissues: epidermal, ground, vascular, and also meristematic cell tissue. So it is a reproductive structure of the plant. So this flower over here is an idealized flower. It contains all the parts that I basically want you to label. Not all flowers will look the same. Not all flowers will contain all of these parts. I'll go over this generalized structure first, and I'll go over some main differences that you might see between other types of flowers out there. There's a lot of diversity that exists. You do need to know what all the parts are, what they mean, how to label this, and there are some parts that didn't formally define here. You can look them up in your textbook, but also research them online if you're not sure what they do. So let's go over some main components. This flower is a flower from a wild rose, and what's interesting about it is that it contains both male and female reproductive structures. So the stamens, think of it men, that's the male reproductive structures. It's this long thing over here that's called a filament, which has the anther attached to the top there. The anther contains a pollen sac, which has pollen, which makes pollen grains, so the sperm. Over here we have the carpel, which is the female reproductive structure part. It contains several parts. We have the stigma over here, which is a little sticky part that on which pollen can land and then release some pollen grains. We have a style, and basically the pollen grains will go down here, forming a pollen tube, and eventually enter the ovary, which contains the ovule, which will be fertilized by the pollen grains, which again is like the sperm of the plant. The ovule is like the egg of the plant. So here we see both female and male reproductive parts. Some species of plants have certain plants that will only make flowers with male parts, and other plants will only make flowers with female parts. Some plants will have, within one plant, they'll have some parts of the plant have flowers with female parts, some parts of the plant have flowers with male parts. Over here, this is just a flower that has both male and female parts in one, so a hermaphrodite flower. A few other parts you should know. You should know the receptacle, which is basically like the thickened top portion of the stem on which the fruit and flower develop. You have the sepals over here, which basically enclose the flower as it's developing from a bud, and as the flower blooms, it'll support the petals over here. And petals can have many functions. One thing that they might do in some flowers is they will often be very showy to attract pollinators, and we'll go over a few other examples of what petals can do later on. So you should know what the sepals do, the petals do, and the receptacle does as well as all the other parts that we just discussed in this flower diagram. Please know how to label it. Now, after fertilization that we discussed, after the pollen grain fertilizes the ovule, that will form into a seed, and then it will be surrounded by a mature ovary. So the ovary will actually develop, and that ovary, if it's kind of fleshy and juicy, it's going to be a fruit, but if it's more hard and dry, it'll be called a nut. So the fruit is the mature ovary, and if that fruit is fleshy and juicy, it's a fruit, and if it's harder and dry, we call it a nut. So you should know how to label all these different parts over here. Again, in this flower, we have all structures, male and female reproductive structures. So we have the filament, which holds the anther above the carpel. We have the anther, which contains the pollen sac. So this is the pollen sac over here, which contains pollen, which contains pollen grains. The pollen can go and land on the female reproductive part over here called the stigma. Then the pollen can form a pollen tube and find its way to the ovary, which contains the ovule. This tube leading down to the ovary is called the style. Again, we have a petal for pollinator attraction. We have a receptacle, which basically is the thickened upper portion of the stem on which the flower starts to develop. We have the sepal as well, which encloses the bud as well, the flower as it's budding or starting to grow, and then eventually when the flower blossoms and the petals come out, the sepals might support them, or sometimes they might not do anything anymore. Depends on the flower you're looking at. So we saw, again, the idealized flower. Usually flowers that are pollinated by animals are more showy, like the ones on the left here. They're more showy because the animals are more attracted. The animals can see these and are more attracted to them. Wind-pollinated flowers are often less showy. So here we can see wheat. It's a wind-pollinated flower. It doesn't have to be showy because the wind pollinates it, and the wind is not necessarily attracted to colors, or is not attracted to colors. So color is not an important feature here, but over here it is. Over here we can see something called a dragon arum plant, and it's actually a really, really large, has very, very large flower. And what's interesting about its flower is that it smells like rotting flesh, which is really gross, but what it does is it attracts flies, which act as a pollinator for this particular plant. You do need to be aware of the differences between the flowers of monocots and dicots. So remember that the petals and stamens are in groups of or multiples of 3 for monocots. So you can see that's different from the eudicots, where the petals and the stamens are in groups or multiples of 4 or 5. So over here we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's a group of 5 here. And then we can see over here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have our groupings of our groups of 3, or multiples of 3 over here. So remember that we have multiples of 3 for monocots and multiples of 4 or 5 for the dicots. So now we're going to take a look at the reproductive cycle in angiosperms. We'll look at the female and the male and female contributions. So here we have the anther, which contains the pollen sac, which releases microspores, which basically have pollen grain. The pollen grain is the sperm. Notice there's 2 nuclei here. They're not fused together, so it's considered haploid. And what we're going to see next is that this is going to land on the female part over here called the stigma, and a pollen tube will develop, and the pollen tube is like a little tunnel that allows the sperm nuclei to make their way to the ovary over here, and then eventually to the ovules over here. So let's just zoom into the ovary, which contains the ovules. You can see that the ovules will contain the megaspore, and the megaspore becomes this female gametophyte. And the female gametophyte has the eggs that are going to be fertilized. And you'll notice there's quite a few eggs in there in the female gametophyte, and there's actually, again, two nuclei over here coming towards the female gametophyte. So we might see actually more than one fertilization happen. And so we can see here the sperm still making its way. The sperm egg nuclei are making their way here, and they enter and they're released into the gametophyte, and fertilization starts to happen. So there's some fusion that happens. One of the events, one sperm fertilizes one egg, and that becomes the zygote, and that develops into the embryo, the baby. But then there's another sperm, so the other nuclei, the other nucleus of the sperm, what it does is it will actually fertilize the other 2 eggs that are there, and that forms a triploid. But it's not a baby, it actually becomes something called the endosperm, which becomes the food supply for the developing embryo. So here we can see we have our seed coat, we have our food supply, which formed from that triploid endosperm, and then we have our embryo over here, and eventually this can develop into a seedling, and then it can develop flowers of its own, and then the reproduction cycle can happen all over again. So that is a process involved. Now, where does a fruit come into play? Well, we didn't really show you the whole story. This seed, its ovary will eventually start to mature and form a fleshy protective piece around it. We'll take a look at that in the next slide. So we can see a similar diagram here, except this time we're showing you what happens after that fertilization event to the fruit here. So the seed is made, and then the ovary develops into this mature thing here that we call the fruit if it's fleshy and fruity or juicy, and if it's dry we call it a nut. So this fleshy part that develops around it is actually called a pericarp. A pericarp. So peri means to surround. So the ovary developed into the fruit wall, and the fruit wall is called a pericarp. If it's a fleshy pericarp, we call it a fruit. If it's a dry pericarp, we call it a nut. And then the fruit, as I mentioned, it does have a few different functions. One of them is for protection, and the other one is to disperse the seed. So it's not really to provide nutrients for the embryo, it's more for dispersal methods and for protection of the seed as well. So now when you go to the store and you shop for fruits and vegetables, you should know the difference between them. Usually a mature ovary is going to be considered the fruit, so this is considered a fruit, for example. You can try to guess other things. This over here contains seeds, so it's a mature ovary, so it is considered a fruit. This over here will contain seeds, so it's actually also considered a fruit. The tomato is a fruit, it contains seeds, it's a fleshy pericarp. Over here, this pepper is a fruit. It contains seeds. It's a fleshy pericarp. This over here does not contain seeds. It's a leafy part of the plant. Since it's a leafy part of a plant, it's considered a vegetable. So typically leafy, rooty parts and root parts of plants are vegetables, and then the part that contains the seeds, the mature ovary parts, those are considered the fruits. So there's a little bit of a worksheet to complete to go over what is considered a fruit and what's considered a vegetable from a botanical sense, of course. We use fruit and vegetable in an everyday speak, but biologically speaking, it's sometimes inaccurate. So, for example, now you know that that plums, hopefully you already knew those are fruit. Walnuts, they're considered fruits as well, just a dry pericarp. And peppers, many people don't know that peppers are actually fruits, but they are considered fruits. They have the fleshy pericarp there. So that worksheet is posted online. You should make sure that you complete it to see what misconceptions you might have had beforehand and after this lesson. Hopefully the misconceptions are clarified now. So now maybe this debate can be solved once and for all. Pineapple on pizza. What is your personal preference? One argument is that fruit shouldn't be on pizza, but you got tomato sauce, which is a fruit. You have pepper, oftentimes, which is a fruit. So if you have green pepper, it's a fruit. So if you use that argument, well, maybe it's a little weak now. My personal preference, pineapple on pizza, definitely. So the act of plants mating is called pollination. And there's different ways to do pollination. You can have cross-pollination where pollen from two different plants combine. So for example, you can have this bee take pollen from here and bring it over to the flower of a different plant over here. So that's called cross-pollination. You might have self-pollination where the plant mates with itself. If it's a plant that has flowers which contain both male and female parts, well, the fertilization can simply happen from the anther to the female structures over here. If it's a plant that has flowers that have some male parts and other flowers that have female parts, well, we can still have self-pollination. It's just that the male gametes have to be flown over to the female gametes, maybe through wind, by falling, by other animals, by using a brush like Mendel did to do some pollination. So now you understand how plants like these ones can reproduce through either cross-pollination, which is two different plants, or self-pollination, same plant. It could be same plant, same flower, or same plant, two different flowers on the same plant. So self-pollination type 1, same flower. Self-pollination type 2, different flower on the same plant. Please make sure that you go over the human uses of seeds and fruits, page 601 to 602. It's just a brief reading. Add those to your notes as well. And there's a great video over here to go over the flowering plants, just in case you had a bit of trouble with it. And please make sure you read page 592 to 602 and complete the learning goals from the Nelson worksheet provided to you. So a lesson to finish up, a little lesson to take away from this topic is that we often think that flowers are, a very romantic gesture to receive, and I guess in a sense they are, but next time you get the flowers and you stick your nose into them, remember that they are actually plant genitals. Quite interesting.